Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer and completely dismantle that classic Hollywood cinematic trope of brutal, fatal combat. When we fire up our favorite movies or TV shows, we are constantly bombarded with a very specific, highly dramatized version of how ancient warriors interacted. We're sold this vision of absolute destruction, right? Where every encounter is this desperate, bloody struggle that only ends when one person is completely eliminated. And honestly, not to mention, these cinematic fighters seem to possess endless stamina, taking 50 punches to the face like it's absolutely nothing, without ever losing their breath. But as we're going to see today, when we actually look at the historical data and the core philosophies behind defensive martial arts, a completely different narrative emerges. We're going to re-examine the very nature of human conflict through the lens of history, physics, and most importantly, survivability.
So, what if everything the movies taught you about ancient combat is just wrong? We are constantly fed this dramatic idea of fights to the bitter end, but history and physics tell a completely different story about human survival. Ask yourself, if ancient warriors were constantly fighting to the absolute death every single time they stepped onto a battlefield or into an arena, how sustainable would those warrior cultures actually have been? Think about the sheer economics of ancient warfare for a second. Training a professional warrior took years of intense resources, massive amounts of food, and rigorous discipline. Honestly, throwing that valuable investment away in a single reckless match to the death, historically, that was just bad business. The reality is that true combat philosophies, the ones that actually lasted and were passed down through generations, they weren't designed around reckless death. They were meticulously crafted systems that recognized the immense value of keeping fighters alive.
Cinematic trope, brutal fights to the death, versus historical reality, physical preservation, and yielding. There's a profound contrast here between the aggressive cinematic illusion and the real ancient systems. The myth sells us a brutal, unyielding fight to the death. And sure, that makes for incredible, popcorn-munching entertainment, but it's fundamentally flawed as a sustainable practice in the real world. Historically, however, systems centered on minimizing casualties and, perhaps surprisingly, the tactical concept of yielding. The ancient systems we are going to explore today were built on a physical and philosophical breakdown that prioritized keeping the human body intact over pointless, mutual destruction. It really wasn't about who could bleed the most, it was about who could outsmart the conflict itself.
The historical evidence regulating the Roman gladiator. To see this in action, let's look at arguably the most notoriously fierce warriors in popular culture. When you hear the word gladiator, you almost certainly picture a dusty arena, a screaming crowd, and two combatants hacking away at each other until only one remains standing. It's the ultimate symbol of the fight to the death, right? Well, the historical evidence paints a picture that actually challenges everything we think we know about the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum. Roman gladiators did not always fight to the death. In fact, matches were highly regulated. Surprisingly, historical data proves these matches were not lawless bloodbaths at all. Many of their matches were incredibly strict in their oversight. There were strict rules, and they even had specialized senior referees, known as the summa rudius, who literally carried long staffs to separate fighters if things got out of hand, or if a rule was broken. This wasn't chaos, you guys. It was a carefully managed spectacle. And because it was a managed and regulated business, there absolutely had to be a built-in mechanism for the match to end without a fatality. Surrender, a highly regulated mechanism allowing gladiators to yield and ensure survival. So the crucial point here is that yielding was an entirely acceptable and necessary part of the arena. It was designed specifically to keep fighters alive. The historical record explicitly shows that these regulated matches allowed for surrender. A gladiator could yield, often by simply raising a single finger into the air to signal the referee, and by doing so, boom, ensure his own survival. This is a massive paradigm shift from the cinematic trope. The system itself possessed a built-in mechanism for survivability, recognizing that living to fight another day and continuing to entertain the crowds was a fundamental part of the gladiator's reality.
The physical science, defeating the armored samurai. Let's fast forward and travel east to Japan, where this defensive combat philosophy takes on a brilliant engineering dimension in the face of armored samurai. We've looked at the regulations of Rome, but now let's look at the sheer physical science of combat in feudal Japan. Imagine standing across from a highly trained, heavily armed samurai clad in traditional o-yoroi armor, which was meticulously crafted from scales of iron and tough leather, all laced together with silk. If your goal is survival, how in the world do you handle an opponent who is virtually impervious to standard empty-handed attacks?
Step 1. Opponent wears armor. Step 2. Striking against armor is physically ineffective. Step 3. Utilize throws and pins using the attacker's energy. This brilliantly illustrates the tactical logic behind the development of early jiu-jitsu. The practitioners of this martial art looked at the heavily armored samurai and realized a very simple, very painful truth. Punching solid metal is a terrible idea. You are literally only going to shatter your own hand and make the samurai very angry. Since striking was completely off the table, they had to invent an entirely different approach. The solution? Borrow the attacker's own energy. Instead of fighting the armor, they used leverage, throws, and joint pins to bring all that heavy iron crashing to the ground, neutralizing the threat without throwing a single punch.
The philosophical conclusion: Aikido. This energy-efficient solution leads us perfectly to another Japanese martial art that fully embodies this paradigm shift. We've seen how the physical realities of thick armor led to jujitsu's throws and pins, prioritizing the redirection of energy over ineffective striking. While Aikido takes this physical and philosophical breakdown of defensive martial arts to its ultimate conclusion. It builds entirely on the concept of moving completely away from brutal destruction, evolving into a highly sophisticated system of self-preservation. The way of harmony. Aikido focuses entirely on this beautiful concept, shifting the goal completely from destroying the enemy to pacifying the encounter. Just let that phrase sit with you for a moment. The way of harmony. It was developed by Morihei Ueshiba, who famously believed that true victory is not defeating an opponent, but defeating the very idea of conflict itself. It stands in direct, total defiance of the cinematic trope we discussed at the very beginning of this explainer. The focus is no longer on a fight to the bitter end. The entire philosophy is built around harmonizing with the aggression to ensure everyone's survival.
It redirects an attacker's momentum and utilizes joint locks. Instead of using brute force, an Aikido practitioner uses these specific mechanics to borrow an attacker's momentum and survive the encounter. Just like the jiu-jitsu practitioners who realized striking armor was completely useless, Aikido relies on redirecting an attacker's momentum. By utilizing circular, fluid movements and incredibly precise joint locks, the practitioner takes the aggressive energy brought by the attacker and safely guides it away into a pin or a throw. It is survival achieved through yielding and redirection, executed flawlessly in real time.
Kinetic negotiation. Reframing violence as a physical dialogue of energy redirection, rather than a fight to the death. And this brings us to the ultimate reframe. Treating violence not as a terminal clash, but as a kinetic negotiation. This is really the synthesis of everything we've looked at today. From the highly regulated, surrender-allowing matches overseen by Roman referees, to the momentum-redirecting throws of jiu-jitsu against armored samurai, to the harmonious philosophical joint locks of Aikido. None of these enduring historical systems were about fighting to the death. They were about keeping people alive. They were a physical dialogue, a kinetic negotiation, where energy is skillfully redirected and managed, rather than just brutally and mindlessly destroyed.
So if survival historically relied on kinetic negotiation rather than destruction, how does that transform our understanding of conflict? I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. If the most legendary warriors in human history, from the grand arenas of Rome to the battlefields of feudal Japan, survived by yielding, regulating, and redirecting energy, how does that change the way you view the nature of human conflict today? Next time you sit down to watch a mindless, brutal movie fight, remember the actual history. Remember the way of harmony. Remember the physical science of yielding. And remember that true survival has always been a masterful, kinetic negotiation.